All right, welcome to part 2 of Jonas Salk's Survival of the Wisest. In this one, we're going to do more of a presuppositional critique to try to understand more why Jonas Salk thinks it's necessary to kill off half the population and to mess with your DNA, as well as his idea that the population needs to be bureaucratically managed by a scientific elite. So we begin in an introduction, and once again we must note that Darwinian evolution, plays a large part in understanding Jonas Salk's worldview. It is the paradigm through which everything here is interpreted. To him and his people, it is the force and the process of all history. And so, if we read on page X of the introduction, he says science and technology are seen as the cause of man's malaise, but he says they are also the effect, that is, the process of evolution itself. And so we have this idea that technology, the advancement, like because you have iPhones and such, this sort of proves evolution. And of course, nature selecting the fittest and the wisest, he attributes the naturalist fallacy, where he says also on page X that wisdom is of practical value for human survival, and that the hypothesis proposed in this book is that man can learn wisdom from nature. And so what he's doing is imposing an impersonal force and telos to nature, which essentially replaces the personal God. And he says on the next page that we might learn how to behave not merely in terms of the past, but in consideration of the effect of alternatives from which we might choose based upon our knowledge of the way or the wisdom of nature. And so to him, we must allow science and nature to dictate our behavior. And again, it is his scientific class that is going to translate to us what nature means. And then he says that his purpose was to search for a natural explanation for the inversion in values occurring in our time. And of course, he's going to contribute this to the natural progression, the natural evolution of man. But that's not the answer. The answer is actually easy. It is his elite class's propaganda through the CIA and the NGOs and such, feminism, modern art, the hippie movement, Vatican II, so on and so forth. All these movements have been directed and guided, which leads to these natural inversions he keeps referring to. And so we move into chapter 1 on page 2. He says, a major threat to the species is attributed to the increasing size of the human population. And this is a major theme that you're going to see with all these scientific and technocratic writers, this Malthusian overpopulation crisis. He says that polluters who befoul the planet affect the quality of life and are regarded as a threat to the present and future equilibrium of the species and of the planet. He says, hence we are to be concerned not only with man's relationship to nature, but with man's relationship to himself. And this is the same line you get from the global Rome and fellas like that man is the enemy of man. And now he's really not going to define really what polluters mean, which I think is pretty important, because I don't think he just means people to throw gum wrappers into the lakes. And he goes on to say that we cannot establish the reality of the illusion that everything in nature has a preconceived or predestined purpose. And he says that this is an illusion that arises in part from the order that prevails in the universe. There is order in the universe. There is order. There's just no God or purpose. He says on the next page that it is as if living forms possessed a property that demands survival and evolution, hence the illusion of purpose in nature. Now, previously he said that we need to look to nature because nature is wise. Yet, nature is purposeless, meaningless. Seems like to be immediately, within 3 pages, an inherent contradiction in his worldview. And he goes on to say that man must devise and exercise naturalistic forms of regulation and control. We must look to nature to help us regulate and control man. But again, nature is meaningless, purposeless. So why would we do that? And then he proposes that there's meaning and telos in the overall evolutionary scheme of things. He says that man has not seen the importance of understanding life's purpose, and therefore his purpose, where he fits into the evolutionary scheme of things. And so through all of this contradictory mumbo jumbo, once again, what we have here is a complete removal of metaphysics, ontology, as it is understood in a theistic worldview. And yet all they do is replace it with evolution and nature. They replace this personal God with an impersonal force and impersonal nature, essentially as pantheism. He even goes on to say on the next page, page 4, that if we are going to fulfill the purpose of life as required by nature, that we must serve nature. And in doing so, man must regulate man. We must have forced austerity. He says at the bottom of the page that the conflict in the human realm is now between self-expression and self-restraint within the individual. And therefore, we are at a fork in the road where man now must choose self-restraint over unleashing destructive and what he says pathological greed at the expense of the constructive and creative individuals. He means, of course, him, the wisest. And he says in the latter case, a strong reaction can be expected to develop in response to the sense of order upon which their survival is based. So we need to be restricted so that they can survive. And so we move on to chapter 2, page 7, where he gets into overpopulation. And he implies here that it has consequences. And then he suggests that man needs to limit man or else nature will. He says, will man create his own procedures to deal with them, or will nature's simple ways come into play, some of which may prove quite undesirable from man's point of view? And again, we need to ask, if purpose in nature is illusory, then why would nature have any reason whatsoever to care about man's population? And so to come up with why he believes that there would be consequences of overpopulation is due to a fruit fly experiment, a model of fruit flies in a closed system. And he comes up with what he calls the sigmoid curve. And you got to look this up. It was done by Raymond Pearl in 1929. It was a fruit fly population experiment. And this experiment established a growth curve for organisms. And in it, he says after a slow start, then there'll be a rapid increase, and then there'll be a slower rate until a leveling off of this population. And this he felt could give predictive abilities of the future human population, which he turned out to be very wrong. His numbers and his predictions turned out to be very wrong. And to me, it just shows you can't make a statement about human beings by studying insects or the animal kingdom. We got to stop doing this. And on page 12, he says, since the earth is a closed system, he falsely suggests, as Pearl did, that there would be a stabilized population to an optimal level. And on the previous page, he says cancer cells are the only organism observed that doesn't fit this model of the sigmoid curve. He's sort of insinuating that man is a cancer on Earth. And that's some nonsense that you'll constantly hear from people like, Neil Tyson deGrasse and Bill Nye and all these other clowns that get on TV. You constantly hear from the echo people that, man's the cancer on Earth. And so Salk suggests that we use this S-curve of the sigmoid model to determine and establish the optimal population number. He even goes so far as to say on page 12 and page 13 that man's attitude toward human life would have to alter significantly for patterns to be endured. he is more likely to choose other ways than catastrophe for maintaining optimal numbers on the face of the earth while remaining within the limit of available resources. So he's suggesting that they will choose other ways than to allow nature to take its course for maintaining optimal number of population. He is saying that man must take the role of nature and limit man. And so who does he cite about overpopulation? Paul Ehrlich, the guy who wrote The Population Bomb. Now, this is the guy who predicted another ice age, by the way. So before, they were obviously wrong and had to change to now global warming. In fact, all of Paul Ehrlich's predictions were pretty wrong. And on page 15, he says that he would like to explore the possible meaning of the similarities observed in the human population growth curve and the first portion of this fruit fly growth curve, as well as other subsystems of living systems. He says, since through the process of natural selection, living organisms which have survived have revealed their fitness for persistence thus far in the evolutionary scheme, we would like to have some prevision of man's program. So again, his worldview is Darwinian's survival of the fittest. Now, this tautology, or circular reasoning, is assumed to be true, and he assumes that all life struggles to preserve itself. And this is, of course, the worldview that about 90% of the population holds, and to which I will briefly refer to Francis Parker Yockey's critique of Darwinism. And in Yockey's Imperium, page 66, or starting on page 66, he gives a critique of Darwinism as a worldview. And he says that Darwinism, his theory of evolution is Malthusian. He says that this tautology, survival of the fittest, implies or presupposes an actual struggle for competition, which Yockey refutes. And he says that Darwinism was then converted into a world outlook. It is free trade capitalism. It is progressive. It is utilitarian. He says, quote, as a worldview, Darwinism cannot be refuted since faith is always stronger than facts. However, as a picture of the facts, it is grotesque from its first assumptions to its last conclusions. First, there is no struggle for existence. He later says Darwin and Malthus are capitalistic outlooks. They place economics at the center of life, the meaning of life. It is their worldview imposed onto the animal kingdom. These tautological explanations only convinced people because they believed it already. The age was evolutionary, materialistic. Darwin combined these two qualities into a biologico-religious doctrine, which satisfied the capitalistic imperative of that age. Yockey goes on to conclude, quote, whatever explanation one gives of how life started only reveals the structure of his own soul. Any inputting of purpose to life transcends knowledge and enters the realm of faith. And to this I wholeheartedly agree with. Darwinism was the noble lie. It was the mythos of the British Empire. It was the state mythology like Virgil wrote for the Roman Empire. The British Empire at the time was the apex of all civilization. It was the most culturally evolved and so on and so forth. And Darwinism was a justification for its domination of the world. For other great critiques of Darwinism, you can read Titus Bruckhart's Cosmology and Modern Science. That is found in the book Swordognosis. And then you can read Wolfgang Smith's Cosmos and Transcendence, especially Chapter 4. All right, that will be enough proselytizing for now, and we will move into Chapter 3, starting on page 16. And so over the next couple of pages, he is using this S-curve of growth from the fruit fly experiment to deduce implications for man. he assumes that each generation along this curve shall have a different outlook or worldview and differ from the others. He ascribes some controlling process to the break in the curve from the acceleration to the deceleration, and he deduces that the population would be expected to behave differently from the plateau stage and the earlier acceleration stage. And so he separates the parts of the S into two different curves, the acceleration A and deceleration B. And he says this emphasizes the differences in attitudes and outlooks in the two different stages. And so A represents the past and B represents the future, which he will then characterize. And on page 19, he makes an assumption as to where in this S-curve man currently is, which he says is at or near this point of inflection. Now, how does he know this? It's not very scientific, is it? And he goes on to compare man to fly, in that he states man has a genetically coded patterns of response, or in other words, material determinism. But he also says that man has free will to conflict with those. And to me, that's a mighty tall assumption being made there. And then at the bottom of the page, he says that man can behave in ways that are anti-life or pro-life, anti-evolution or pro-evolution. And so who is going to define those terms for us? And so on page 20, he says, he implies that we have a need for changing values as we transition from Epoch A and Epoch B. And here is where he first uses the terms epoch to describe the two sections of this S-curve of population growth of fruit flies. Again, he is basing the thesis in this book on a growth curve chart of a fucking fruit fly experiment, and one that, when applied to humans, has already been proven to be egregiously faulty. But yet here he is, basing his metaphysical worldview on a damn fruit fly experiment. And so it continues, in Epoch B, those attitudes and attributes which are of the greatest value will determine the real and not merely presumed shape of the population growth curve and the quality of life. Value systems such as prevailed in Epoch A will of necessity have to be replaced by those appropriate for Epoch B, and new concepts will emerge about the nature of man and his relationship to all parts of the cosmos. He's speaking of a replacement metaphysics, that we have to change how man sees himself. And so essentially what he's proposing is that population growth will lead to catastrophe. And since we don't know where we are on this growth curve, we need to flatten it out. And by assuming that there's differences in values of each side of this growth curve, we can deduce that by proactively changing said values, we can then control the population growth. So preemptively alter man's values, or else man will go extinct. He says on the very next page, we need a complete inversion of values, traditions, etc. He says this is required for survival in the next epoch. And so we move into chapter 4, starting on page 22, where he deals with these conflicts and values. And he says, in foreseeing a future as radically different from the past as suggested by the shapes of the curves A and B, man would be expected to react in a manner appropriate to the changing circumstances and altering inner patterns which arise in the course of his own growth and development. He says we speculate that the inversion in values, which we have just referred, is natural accompaniment to the transition associated with the point of inflection, or that break in the S-curve, in the human population growth curve. It suggests the existence in man of the capacity to behave in accordance with more than one value system. There is an overt struggle over values that have been coexisting, which will shift in dominance between these two parts of a conflicting dualism. So what he's saying is there is a battle of coexisting value systems, and one will win and the other will die out. And that man's values are just an evolutionary process. On page 24, he says man is dualistic in nature. He is a system of genetic as well as learned responses. Certain behavior characteristics are genetic, having an effect on patterns of thinking and reactivity. He's speaking of genetic determinism. And thus, innate as well as acquired patterns have a profound effect upon prevalent modes of behavior. These shifts are biological. And to that, I'd say, citation needed. And on pages 25 through 26, he says changes are inevitable and they need to be guided. Evolution is a dialectical process, ergo, cultural evolution is a dialectical process. On 27, he says, that which survives is that which fits best with the changes. Now, Jacques Attali in his book says similarly that a new technology often brings on revolutionary changes in a society. Salk says we must change with these technologies which is usually created and spread by these very same elite. And technology is the guiding principle of these inevitable changes. Technology equals progress. Progress equals evolution. He continues on page 27 by saying that when the rate of change is the greatest, some individuals, the most active in espousing change, join and are joined by those from the mainstream, while others maintain their relatively extreme positions. Those wanting not to change are extreme, by the way. These individuals continue to move in a direction that does not become part of the evolutionary scheme of things and might be judged to be anti-evolutionary. Such extremes, again, not wanting change is an extreme to him, often represents non-fits or misfits. And so we have here is the myth of progress in evolution being basically one and the same. Those who resist progress are anti-evolutionary. And he says at the bottom of the page, these anti-evolutionary group may not survive if they do not go along with these proposed changes. He says on page 28 that new events are selected, same as biological mutations, thus a cultural evolution. And again, you must adapt within these cultural changes or you will not be selected for survival. Nature will judge man's choices in this new epoch, thus revealing the wisdom of our selections. Again, we have this nature over God, nature or Gaia worship, this form of pantheism. And this seems to be a level of determinism. For nature to judge a choice as good or bad presupposes a value system or a universal claim of good, therefore is a metaphysical claim. If nature determines what is good, then what has been selected has already been determined. This suggests nature is omnipotent, suggests a choose this predetermined value or die. And of course, he says on this page that this book and Salk's role is to discern nature. Because, of course, you're too stupid to figure this out on your own. And he says we must create these possibilities for existence in this new epoch. And on page 29, he says, between nature's mutations and selections and man's choices in cultural evolution, nature will win supposedly. Therefore, man must decode nature to survive this next epoch. And only the wise ones can figure out nature and judge what is needed. And on the next page, he says, when he says we must look to those wise ones to guide us into what choices to make. Of course, here he is talking about himself and his ilk. And so essentially he's worried about overpopulation, that there are too many tards being born, which will dilute their quality of life and affect their control over human evolution. And so next we get into chapter 5, And on page 33, he creates the analogy of the, quote, being and the, quote, ego to the genetic and somatic systems. The genetic being contains the programming, and the somatic ego are its expression, like DNA and RNA. He says on 34 that if the ego or somatic system, or RNA, is altered to serve other than the being, DNA, such as cancer or viruses, that this can be destructive. But he says the possibility exists for potentially advantageous effects, such as the virus responsible for tulip colors. And so here he is starting to lay out the case for fucking with your DNA and your RNA. Now, before I move on to the next part, I just want to briefly talk about how Salk here is going to cloak his being and ego metaphors as scientific metabiology, when all it is just a repackaging of the Masonic ideals which people like H.G. Wells laid out. H.G. Wells called it the racial mind, which he doesn't mean race as in separate peoples, but he's talking about like the consciousness. This occult concept of being and becoming, which is this idea of becoming God. It is the underpinning idea of evolution. And that's why people like Salk here talk about controlling and directing man's evolution. They think that they can perfect man to become their own gods. I'm briefly going to read from W.L. Wilmshurst in his book, The Meaning of Masonry, about how evolution is sort of this occult doctrine of becoming. And he says, quote, "This, the evolution of man into Superman, was always the purpose of the ancient mysteries, and the real purpose of modern masonry is not the social and charitable purposes to which so much attention is paid, but the expediting of the spiritual evolution of those who aspire to perfect their own nature and transform it into a more godlike quality. And this is a definite science, a royal art, which it is possible for each of us to put into practice, whilst to join the craft for any other purpose than to study and pursue this science is to misunderstand its meaning." Later in this same book, he says, quote, "Man who has sprung from earth and developed through the lower kingdoms of nature to his present rational state has yet to complete his evolution by becoming a godlike being and unifying his consciousness with the omniscient, to promote which is and always has been the sole aim and purpose of all initiation." To further understand this whole concept, you could always get a book by Philip and Paul Collins called The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship. And in that book, they will trace the entire history of the Royal Society, the Freemasons, science and evolution, and essentially this whole idea and theory is occult doctrine packaged as a scientific worldview. And with that, we move into chapter 6, where he kind of lays this out that when he says metabiologic, he means the being and ego. Being is the immutable, containing, defining info. The ego is the expression of the being, and it can interact with others. The being is like DNA. The ego is like RNA. The being is genetic. The ego is somatic. He's got this nice little sciencey chart laid out on page 40. Very scientific. Very. And on page 41 and 42, he lays out this whole spiel of the transcendence, going beyond the ordinary limits of living matter, surpassing or exceeding the biological. Evolution is a dialectic dualism from non-existence to existence. Evolution formed higher complexity. Man evolved being an ego. Man evolved consciousness. All man is a mutation of chemicals in physical matter. But he admits that this is a problem for physics and admits that this is a metaphysical claim, because you cannot get matter from non-matter. And now we get to the fun stuff. Chapter 7, starting on page 43, titled Mutations. So evolution is just mutation and then selection. Selection implies preference according to the prevailing values. Values, of course, is a judgment and a metaphysical claim. Nature has values. Do we derive our values from observing nature? And he says here on page 43, sexual reproduction may be seen as a producer of mutations. He says, quote, mutations, as here defined, would also be produced by the introduction, either naturally or experimentally, of a virus into a sperm or egg cell, the genetic information of which would then be incorporated into either DNA or RNA and transmitted. So if all you are is a random mutation that nature decides to select, then he sees no issue with causing random mutations that you would pass on to your offspring, altering your RNA and DNA, and then let nature select those. And remember, this is a virologist who creates inoculations, introducing things into your body. He also says on page 44 that new perceptions arise from time to time, which occur spontaneously or deliberately. He says this is analogous in its transmittability from generation to generation by cultural means. He said these new perceptions can be spread like a virus of the mind, I'd add, to alter favorably or unfavorably man's behavior. And once again, we need to point that favorability is a value judgment. But here we have this idea of changing man's perception, changing man's image of man, which is the title of a book that I'm going to cover very shortly, one in which Willis Harman cites this book, Survival of the Wisest, as a case study. But to finish off this thought, Jonas Salk says that revolutionary ideas are the evolutionary equivalent to mutations. And on page 45, he says man's consciousness has been expanding through science. And he says that men will be uneven in their capacity for such understanding. So some of us are smart, some of us are dumb, naturally. And he says the ones with imagination and intellect play vital roles in man's evolution. Once again, he is referring to himself. And again, we deal with scientism. The idea that science itself can give us the answer to man's nature and his relationship to the cosmos. And so he continues saying that metaphors and analogies are to be used to express this in ways suitable to minds at the different levels, so that the same meaning may be understood by all. And so he's proposing we need a common language and a common metaphysics. He even argues for a common, religion, which I believe science serves. He says to form an organism of mankind and no longer a collection of individuals. And he says on 46 that we should use the arts to express this scientism. He says by artists we mean poets, playwrights, novelists, people who convey by metaphor what the scientist tries to express explicitly of the nature of the universe he studies. And so when he talks about using the arts to spread these ideas, one immediately thinks of Stoner Saunders' work about the cultural Cold War. And so we move on to chapter 8, starts on page 47, and he begins this chapter by begging the question regarding revolutionary changes that were prevalent in the 60s and the early 70s. He falsely attributes them to a change in the relationship between this being and ego, a change in human values and behavior. He falsely claims it is evidence of continued growth and evolution. Now, I have multiple points of contention here. One is the progress fallacy. He is making an a priori assumption that the changes are actually progress. and then he makes a value claim that these are indeed positive changes. But mainly, he is completely ignoring or is ignorant of the fact that the CIA and foundations of the elite have been manipulating culture and art using propaganda to undermine religion and the family, using the mass media they control to propagandize and brainwash the masses into believing whatever narrative they wish to spin. But yeah, sure, these changes are all just natural progression of evolution, apparently. And so, naturally, he calls for us to disregard all of our past institutions and values and develop new ones that are more appropriate to today's changing circumstances. And we can ask, where have you heard this trope before? This is the main liberal talking point about basically any political or cultural topic. So you can see how this works. And on page 48, what is one of these new values that we must develop? Depopulation. The old overpopulation scare, that we must restrict these freedoms to protect other freedoms. And then he even admits that, quote, the original intent of this book was to draw attention to the role of value systems as control and regulatory factors which operate in an apparently intuitive way, guiding man toward or away from survival. And after a couple pages of rambling on, page 51, he says that anything that doesn't agree with his ideas here that lead to further evolution are, quote, anti-evolutionary, which must be extirpated or rooted out, destroyed completely, as enemies of the evolutionary process itself. So yes, all you Christians and conservatives and traditionalists, you are anti-evolutionary. You are the problem. And he sees it that you need to be rooted out and destroyed completely because you are anti-evolutionary. And he says on page 52 that distinction and choices will be made for factors favoring evolution versus those that do not. Those factors that do not will not survive. Now, I must remind you that he has already said that we are transitioning to a new epoch, and that values and behaviors must change to be selected for this new epoch, for man to survive. So he is saying that anyone who doesn't go along with these changes is not going to survive. And then we get into, on page 53, we get into his tautology, which is existence implies evolution. Well, how do you know it evolved? Because it survived. It exists. Yeah, this is begging the question. And then we get to the point he so desperately wants to make, and the point of the book. Quote, it doesn't just mean survival of the fittest, but the survival of that which fits best. Purpose and status is relative to the needs for survival. Survival is a prerequisite for evolution. Evolution is essential for survival. Existence depends on the establishment of patterns of order relevant to a dynamic evolutionary process. Thus, for men to evolve and survive requires judgment for continued existence that will have to be wise. So deep. And so we arrive to survival of the wisest. And by wisest, again, he means those who comprehend the evolutionary process and the being and becoming process, and who can make those choices to enhance possibility of existence. Again, himself and his scientific class, the technocrats, the elite. But again, as we pointed out earlier, this whole idea of being and becoming is just an occult, Masonic idea. This isn't science. This isn't scientific. This is just occult mumbo-jumbo presented to you as some sort of scientific theory. And this is what he took about 50 pages to set up, this whole idea. And again, this idea of a great change and a new epoch, which there's no evidence of, which is based on some stupid fruit fly experiment. That this is the basis for why the elite should direct mankind, decide that not only should we completely invert all of our values, but they get to decide what these new values should be. And so we move to chapter 9, and on page 57, he makes the case that values and morality should come from nature and not man, which can be sort of a euphemism for tradition, religion, culture, etc. And of course, these new patterns that must be taken to survive is the move past individualism and into globalism. And on page 62, he suggests that we must liberate ourselves from restricting ethics and values and mores to achieve a greater evolution. It is culture that holds back these geniuses. And so we get to chapter 10 on page 63, to distinguish the wholesome from the sick. And he says that nature is relative, and that we must distinguish between wholesome and sick in choosing options for evolution and survival. And once again, to be wise, we must learn this from nature. And on 65, he says, if man fails to judge and act wisely in maintaining his life and the process of evolution, nature can be expected to take an active hand in correcting his errors. But evolution is supposed to be random mutations, accidents, purposeless, meaningless. And this implies something that's more than that. This now goes from a scientific theory more into a religious dogma. He says, man must try to know as much as possible about nature's way of error correcting through mechanisms of regulation and control. And this is what makes this ideology so dangerous, is he makes a universal claim, unfounded, about nature. Then he claims that we must take nature's role at, regulating, controlling man. And he says it's nature's tendency to eliminate the unfit, or those who do not fit well. And he says it's man's tendency to try to preserve human life, regardless of fitness. This whole ideology is just so anti-human. It's satanic. And so he goes on at the bottom of the page and on to 66, saying that man cannot exist free from this law of nature. He says on 66 that man needs to fulfill nature's role of selecting the fit and the wise. Man needs to regulate man. Man must also act aggressively against men who do not value evolution. He says changes from Epoch A to Epoch B, which there's no evidence of, are inevitable, which prods his desire to change man. He says, quote, it is likely that the cost in human life of such changes will be considerable, especially if man doesn't act in accordance to nature, which his pre-scientific class will interpret for you, of course. And so in 67, he says man must understand nature so that he may cooperate with it to his advantage. He says, quote, this implies a need for the development of ego structure for education and for training. He says that man must learn to discriminate between the qualities of things if he is to distinguish the pathological from the healthy. He must recognize the existence among his numbers of the destructive. He needs to understand the causes, cures, and the means for prevention of those that dissent. And so he says, basically, we must propagandize this worldview. We must teach kids to recognize those who don't agree with them. This is the correct view of the healthy versus the disease, in his opinion. And so we move on to chapter 11, starting on page 68. And on page 69, he says that man's psychological and sociological behavior resembles the immunological system. Therefore, choices must be made as to which of these behaviors serves to protect versus the ones that are foreign and destructive. But it does say that there are some that are usefully destructive that we must maintain. He says these value judgments are relative, as is evolution. They're not objective or absolute. He says that objective, universal claims as the basis for ethics, metaphysics, values, and etc. He says these are anti-evolutionary. He says absolutists are extremists who see life exclusively from their own narrow, rigid viewpoint. Now remember what he just said about anti-evolutionary people. This guy is calling for population reduction, messing with your DNA, completely inverting your values. If you don't agree with him, you need to be killed off. But absolutists are the extremists? Just amazing. And so on page 70, he says, it behooves man to be wise as nature. And by that he means to use a value system corresponding to that of nature. He says nature favors pro-evolutionary over anti-evolutionary attributes in man. I love how he sets up his straw man with these tautologies. It's a fantastic work. On page 71, he says we have to choose the wisest for positions of influence and of power. He says the struggle for survival will be between the wise and the unwise, evolutionist versus non-evolutionist. And again, we must remember his definition of evolutionist and non-evolutionist. He says non-evolutionists will be replaced or else man will go extinct. So essentially we must replace religion with scientism or we're going to go extinct. On 72, he says science will serve as the basis of what is, quote, right, and the base for judgment for the masses. And this is a fun little contradiction here because if science is based on the observation of nature, and nature is relative, and that is the basis of what is right, then of course what right and wrong is relative. So why should we choose what he considers right if it's relative? It's not objective. And Salk tends to repeat himself quite a bit in this boring book. On 74, once again, says his fruit fly experiment reveals that survival depends upon the development of means for the adjustment of behavior. So obviously man needs to alter his values. And he says in 75 that double win and win-lose resolutions will be employed appropriately, and that who fits best as well as the fittest will be chosen for survival. Meaning they will allow you to keep certain values or identities only if it isn't anti-evolutionary. And of course, this takes wisdom, which the scientific elite will decipher from nature and use science in dealing with life and death. And on page 76, he's got this nice little table for us here where it shows Epoch A, which was traditional and objective. Epoch B needs to be relative and changing. Epoch A is anti-death, anti-disease. Epoch B is pro-life, birth control, self-restraint. He says man has a choice. Of course, he lays out this false dichotomy. And then he says nature is choosing men that alter their values. He says on 77 that the wisest may be able to influence or direct human evolution, which is, again, as we discussed earlier, this Freemasonic occult idea. It's utter garbage. But he says on 78 that some men have begun to move toward this goal. And so we move into chapter 12. We're on page 81. He again describes pro-life as limiting or reducing population, relativism, austerity, regulation. And he describes pro-death as objective, not limiting the population, not altering one's behavior to this technocracy. And so he says they shall develop the necessary new educational systems and techniques for accomplishing such purposes, if we are convinced that they are among the important contributions needed now and in the future. And he even, here on 82, he even sort of predicts Greta and these youth movements, where he says, especially among the young, they feel committed, they compare the consciousness they have of their being with that of others in relation to the needs of their time as they correct the errors of the past. But once again, we ask, if everything is just relative, then why? Why do we feel compelled to force this ideology on people? He says on page 83, it will be necessary to develop from birth an educational system designed to produce these effects consciously, deliberately, and as effective as possible. He says, if a new morality is to emerge, and if the wisest are to endure and their descendants to survive, it will be because they have found a way to learn and to teach their wisdom in a world that they have inherited, and which seems to be ripe for this kind of metamorphosis. So he's concerned with him and his people shaping the world that's fit for them, not for you, but for them and their descendants. And once again, he says those that will carry on will be the one that fit best. So again, we have a value judgment here that we should probably be questioning by what does he mean by fit best? Fit best how? And so he says on 84, if we wish to reduce the number of those who are purposelessly destructive without at the same time adversely affecting the evolutionary process, that we need to distinguish between useful and non-useful destructive behavior. He said war was a product of evolution. He says, but it also kind of took out too many of his people, the wise ones, of course. And he says that we need to still have what he calls useful destruction without interrupting the wisest. So he means we still need to be able to find a way to get rid of all the traditionalists and the religious people. And so on 85, he rambles a little bit to say that it is necessary to discover ways to reduce the population. And he says that this is not beyond the vision of his elite. And on 85, he even sort of admits that believing in God and having morals and ethics that are based on this belief stops these people from believing all of this bullshit mumbo jumbo. And so he says, thus arises the obligation for truth in dealing with man, even through metaphor and analogy, are necessary to communicate the nature of reality to the young, especially in a form closest to that revealed by scientific methods. So again, they're going to use metaphor and analogy to the dumbed down masses with scientism. And again, once again, he says that we will use the arts to diffuse these ideas. Again, we can think of the CIA, the Cultural Cold War by Stoner Saunders. And then on 86, he starts talking a lot about consciousness and the sleep. And I think this is where his ideas mesh with the book of Changing Images of Man, where, they talk about expanding consciousness to become aware of the cosmos. LSD, bringing LSD, this Far East yoga type religious pantheism blended with the occult and scientism. Like all these ideas are discussed in Changing Images of Man. Some we'll get to a little bit later. But on page 90, he talks about the disparity in media and in education between countries and how that's an issue. Because it's hard to propagandize everyone, to get everyone on the same page with the same messaging if they don't all have the same access. And he says on 92, it will be necessary for all of us to see ourselves and others from this same point of view. This idea is similar to what Huxley describes, that distinctions equal conflict and hierarchy and good versus bad. And he says that we must iron out all inconvenient differences. And he says on 93, this is why they must arrest the destructive and pathological, and they must be judged in evolutionary terms. And again, this idea of judged. If nature is relative and morals and values are relative, then why does anyone need to be judged? When you start asking these questions, you realize this is very much a religion to these people. And Salk is their zealot. And so he says at the bottom of page 93 and then to 94 that man must suppress destroyers. So they're going to get us to police ourselves. And so he gets into the part where he describes how we need to manage society. And he says that everyone needs to be put into a category of hierarchy and play their role, do their part. And on 95, he says this hierarchy is based upon native talents and abilities and the discipline capacity to perform and grow to the fulfillment of the individual. We need disciplined management to balance excess and insufficiencies. And of course, he's speaking of this scientific, technocratic managerial class. They're the ones who are going to do this. Don't believe me? Well, on 98, he actually says that there is a more highly evolved and highly developed individuals, and the society may be forced to yield to allow individuals more freedom to live with their own being and with their fellow men in a system which protects the species' interests but does not thwart the interests of these creative beings. So society needs to just get out of the way of these highly evolved elites. And so we get to chapter 14, starting on page 100. And on 102, he is calling for you, the ignorant masses, to play your part, to sacrifice. Don't have kids so that Jonas here and his scientific elite can pass on their genetics to save the human race. This is like some Jeffrey Epstein shit. And once again, he calls on it being necessary to develop a way to educate and train everybody to this level of thinking. And on 103, he says it's time to move on from the Enlightenment ideals of individualism, which, once again, I'll refer to changing images of man. This is something they talked about in a post-industrial society, that we need to move past these ideas. These ideas are no longer good for our age, this epoch. And on 105, once again, he says the problem is birth control, which is somehow pro-life, I guess, in some Orwellian sense. And then we get to chapter 15, starting on 106. And on page 107, he says, thus society must develop new systems for identifying and dealing with those who are heretofore regarded as criminal and are now regarded as pathological. And again, defining criminal and pathological as anti-evolutionary. All the people that don't agree with all these changes that they want to implement. And on 113, he insinuates that there needs to be some sort of bureaucratic management of the unwise, that they can't think for themselves, they can't do for themselves, that they can't discover this for themselves. They need to be managed, they need to be taught, they need to be educated. And he says on 114 and 115 that there are interested groups in fulfilling this. And he lists foundations, governments, NGOs, and he says that these are responsible for behavior modifications. And finally, we have reached the conclusion, starting on page 116. And he says that this was a future alternatives-based analysis, which is very similar to the guys at SRI. And on pages 116 and 117, he touches on the idea that advances in technology modify man, as if it is part of the evolutionary process itself, and that is a basis of the idea of controlling or directing man's evolution. Again, we need to alter our behavior due to new circumstances that we created, which, if you think about it, this doesn't comport with this random mutation idea. And on 120, he actually says that we need to intervene judiciously in the process of biologic and metabiologic evolution. So again, we have this idea that we need to intervene with your DNA and your RNA to make sure that we don't de-evolve. And again, this is a guy who invented introducing live viruses into your body. But he kept saying throughout to evolve metabiologically, this ego being, so that to have a better fulfillment and quality of life. And on 122, he says a new syndrome has developed, purposelessness or nihilism. And so this is why it is needed to have a better quality of life and fulfillment. Further need to entertain the unwise masses, essentially because they just get in the way. And finally, on page 123, he says we need to replace religion as a guiding moralistic factor. Basically replace it with scientism. And essentially through that, we can change man's image of himself. We can expose him to the, quote, laws of nature. And this will lead to new attitudes and new behavior. Now, he doesn't mean actual laws of nature. He means the scientific managerial class corruption and interpretation of nature, as so that they can socially engineer the unwise masses. This essentially is the point of this book. So I'm sorry it was so long, but I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that this helps you understand the worldview of our elite, because they all share this view. This is not just a unique person's perspective. This is pretty much perpetuated in every single book that you'll read by these people. So thanks for taking the time to listen, and see you on the next one.